This is Changeling the Podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the Podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibes. I'm your host, Josh, and with us is your other host, Puka. Say hi, Puka.
Salutations.
So, what are we talking about today, Puka?
A lot of things. A lot of bits and pieces. It's our first recording of 2025, and that feels significant. But
So, if you haven't heard our announcements, good friend of the show and several-time guest co-host Terry Robinson passed away. Also host of Mage the Podcast. And we're still pretty shooken up by that. I think the whole community is.
I think it's been really inspiring, though, in the way that so many people, as a method of honoring his memory, have really kind of moved forward with do stuff. And I'm not the kind of person who will say, oh, so-and-so would want this or so-and-so would appreciate this, because I don't like doing that. But I do think, from my experience of knowing him, that does feel to me like the best way I can remember him.
Yeah, there are some things I think people who knew him would know what he'd want in certain situations.
Oh, yeah. Well,
yeah.
I wouldn't call myself one of them. But yeah,
I don't know. He was pretty up to date on that. Like he was very enthusiastic and wanted people to do things and contribute and
connect
a lot of
with
hobbies.
each other.
Yeah, and connect. Yeah. So I think we can say he'd want that. People to continue to do that.
And I know that I really kind of was pushing the narrative of we are hibernating for weeks as we entered our winter regnum season. But at the same time, I'm like, there's things to say. There's only so many weeks in the year. I've got time. I've got a microphone. We might as well talk about various bits of lore into the world that we haven't yet gotten to. So, also, it's freaking cold out, and this is better than going outside.
So we had news here that 2024 was the first year in all of recorded history for Ottawa that did not get below minus 20.
Oof.
And we still haven't, but it is now like minus 15 Celsius. So,
all right.
But,
well,
yeah.
So you're off to a good start.
It's at least feeling normal because we didn't have any snow or whatnot till December, which is bizarre.
We've gotten a few small but solid snowfalls, and it is, I think, for the past few days, it has not gotten above 0 Celsius, and it won't for at least a couple weeks, which is brutal, but at least feels more normal. So,
yeah.
Anyway, speaking of winter.
Yeah.
Well, before we get to speaking of winter, speaking of autumn and then winter.
Yeah. So we're going to actually do a bit of a grab bag because I think we realized that there was a little bit more Changeling content in official published books.
Yeah.
And we're going to do the grab bag of the Mind's Eye Theater stuff that's left over. None of them are specific Changeling books, but they all have like sections and chapters and stuff that are Changeling.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be as long as you might think, listener.
Yeah, this is a minisode. Don't get too comfortable.
Yeah, but let's start with, I guess, Laws of the Hunt.
/ Laws of the Hunt Player's Guide. It's difficult to separate the two.
Yeah, I don't understand what happened here. There was Laws of the Hunt, which was a LARP book for playing all kinds of hunters.
Mortal hunters, though.
Yeah, mortal
hunters.
Not
imbued hunters.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
And then they came out with Laws of the Hunt Player's Guide, which almost entirely contains the same text, but less of it, except for they added mummies.
Groovy.
So I guess... And what is it? I read Laws of the Hunt mostly, and you read Laws of the Hunt Player's Guide mostly?
Isn't there also a Laws of the Hunt Revised somewhere in the mix?
That is Laws of the Hunt Revised.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's the revised era. There was, I think there might have been earlier Hunter things, but I don't even think that's available on drive-thru. So, yeah.
So from what I could tell, it seems like, well, maybe it's both books, it's primarily geared towards, sorcerers, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's character creation for mortals, but then it's the Numina and the hedge magic and all of that.
Or, Project Twilight stuff, or, what's they called? The Arcanum.
Okay, all right.
So it's, all those things. and then also Dauntain.
Yeah. And in the player's guide, the introduction to the chapter for the Dauntain says they should have been included in Laws of the Hunt, but
But
weren't.
they are.
Importantly, though, regardless, from what I could tell, Pete Woodworth was not one of the authors for that chapter.
Mm-hmm.
So, or for that book in general. So it's unclear how much the
Yeah.
authors understood Changeling or the Shining Host.
I'd say they understood it. Like, I don't get ideas that they didn't
Well,
understand it.
they certainly read the Autumn People. Say
Yeah, there
that.
was some weird changes of terminology.
Mm. Well, so I went through with an eye for like, is there anything new that this book can teach us about the Dauntain? And
Mm-hmm.
the short answer is no, not really.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe they changed a
Yeah.
couple little
Yeah.
bits.
It's kind of funny also in that book. They didn't get a section header, so it's the Arcanum starts talking about the Dauntain, and then it just continues on with all the Dauntain stuff.
Ah, see, in the player's guide, they have their own chapter.
Yeah. So this is set during the War in Concordia meta plot. It advanced it a little bit beyond what the tabletop books did, but not by much, saying that like it's gotten to the point where mortal authorities are now noticing weird patterns in murders and stuff, basically the casualties of war, but they don't
Hmm.
know that. They're like, why are all these teens and early 20 people and like mostly young people just getting killed
Womp womp.
weirdly in different places? And then it gets into like character creation, which is a little bit confusing in how it's done, but the main thing, it's mainly like like a changeling character, like a normal changeling character, but you add +2 banality. I suggest buying more banality depending on like to get yourself up to at least 6.
Hmm.
And the new terminology says autumn people is the blanket term for heavy sleepers, which is what autumn people is.
Yeah.
Autumn Fae, which would in C20 terms would be undone, and Dauntain, and then has rules for playing Autumn Fae as well,
Ah, okay.
along with Dauntain.
Player's guide doesn't have that.
Yeah, no, there's more in this. Yeah, it has lore requirements for like this is a thing that shows up a lot in LARP stuff. Like it gets very specific as to how much you know about things,
Hmm.
but it's specifically targeted. It's mentioning how much Gramarye you have to decide like, oh, you have this much Gramarye, you know this much about Dauntain kind of thing. Extra rule like I don't think this was in the Autumn People. Like if you have a birthright that costs glamour, you have to spend an extra point.
Oh, no.
The dooms are pretty similar, just sort of translated to Mind's Eye Theater mechanics. It did in revised Mind's Eye Theater. It did this thing that I actually some people liked, and I'm kind of realized that I don't like. It like too directly translates things from tabletop to LARP in ways that are
Hmm.
kind of sometimes not great. I mean, it does also have rules for Cold Iron, and then it goes through what does each level of banality mean in a chart. But this chart's way more harsh than C20. Like for instance, banality 5, though incredibly heavy with banality by face standards, only extremely open-minded grumps or moral drunks and lunatics regularly remain at this level for long.
I think that's from the. So when I refer back to Autumn People, I'm also including the appendix of the original player's guide, which had the
Okay.
errata left out of Autumn People. And I think that was from that,
Okay.
because that's where they first had the thorough descriptions of the different banality levels.
Okay. But anyway, it's very harsh compared to C20, where it's like, no, nobody's, unless you're a child, you're not banality below 5 or really below 6.
Mhm. So this is interesting to hear all this because the player's guide has none of this
Yeah,
stuff.
what's in the player's guide is everywhere. I didn't like 100% check, but it looked just copy pasted from Laws of the Hunt.
So the player's guide had essentially just the brief write-ups of the dooms and then the stigmas and agendas. So there was nothing
Yeah,
about the different levels of banality, nothing about Autumn Fae, nothing about Cold Iron.
yeah,
My main complaint with the player's guide was like, well, this is all well and good, but it doesn't really give me much information about how to actually run these in a game.
yeah.
Like, if I were a player who wanted to play a Dauntain, I would look at this and be like, cool powers, bro. But in terms of how they integrate into a story and how they interact
Oh,
with the full changelings, it sounds like that book
yeah.
has a lot
It gives
more.
a bit more. I'd say
Okay.
I'm not saying the advice is very thin on the ground. I found, but
Well,
the
a bit more than zero is still
yeah,
significant. So,
yeah. And I think that the intended purpose, although they get into other uses of it, would be you are playing a hunter LARP, which
hmm.
I need more information than any of these books provide on what that means because like I don't understand what you'd be doing in LARP sessions. And it says to keep it usually under 20 players. I'm like, okay. But I don't know. I guess it's a group of regularly meeting hunters a bunch of hunters, like way, because you don't normally see like 20 hunters together or something, right? So some of them could be Dauntain with the idea, or they could be Autumn people, which they also have some rules for.
But in your experience, have people at a general changeling LARP ever wanted to be Dauntain, or is that like reserved for storyteller or whatever?
That was reserved for storyteller.
Okay.
There were questions of some player characters falling to Dauntain.
Well, that's something else which I was like, where is that information? I really wanted to know
Yeah,
about
they
that.
don't really have that, but that could be that combined with this.
Or redemption for that matter, because they
Yeah,
do kind of replicate. So Autumn People has some hints about how the different dooms might pull themselves out of Dauntainhood.
yeah.
And that's kind of replicated in the Laws of the Hunt Player's Guide, but there's no
Hmm.
mechanics or advice for it. So
Yeah, the mechanics for becoming Dauntain are also kind of, I mean, that part just seems to be largely lifted. Like when it talks about that, like the different dooms are just sort of lifted out of.
yeah.
I didn't check again if they copy pasted or rewrote in their own words. I don't know.
These at least they rewrote, yeah.
Yeah. But it doesn't really help much besides like if you want to take stigmas, you have to each stigma gives you a point of banality. Two if
Yeah.
you're she.
In the end, regardless, I would say for anyone who's curious about this book that if you're looking for like expansion on the idea of Dauntainness, Harbingers of Winter is probably still your better bet. So
Yeah. I'm not even sure if I was running a changeling LARP using Dauntain, how much I would use this.
yeah.
There was some other interesting things in some of the other. Oh wait, this is spread across multiple chapters. Sorry, I was looking at chapter 2, the
Uh,
hunters. Then chapter 4 is character creation. First of all, they have character creation rules stuck in chapter 2, the hunters for Dauntain, which are different than the character creation rules, which are like the mortal character creation rules in chapter 4. One interesting thing from Change's perspective is they split up kinane and fairy blood merits.
hmm.
So you can be a kinane, and that has certain implications for being enchanted and some other stuff. And then you can also take fairy blood, which would let you. You have to be. It has a prerequisite, so you have to be kinane, take the kinane merit, then take the fairy blood merits up to 1 to 5, and then that would let you have access to arts and things like that and extra powers. And I feel like that might be a good way to do it in general, especially if you're like looking at the whole question of, well, what if you want to play like a kinane mage or a kinane werewolf or something? And it's like, okay, you could take the kinane merit, but not the fairy blood merit,
Hmm.
because if you don't want to have the werewolves or mages also getting access to arts, but they can still be kinane.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, the other thing is Numenon powers. You have to have at least Banality 7 to take a Stigma, and then each one increases by 1. There's no XP cost, and they don't take a turn. They're very explicit. They don't take a turn to use. They just used. You can use them at the same time using other things, including cantrips.
Hmm.
And it says both Dauntain and Autumn Fae, as in Undone Fae in C20 terms, can learn agendas. And then it has an optional banal bunk sidebar.
Interesting. Well, I'm going to have to go back and flip through that because the player's guide had much less.
Yeah, and the player's guide, same things, slightly reorganized. The only thing is they seem to add mummies.
I mean, I'm 100% in support of more money. So,
But in the hunter book.
yeah, why not?
But anyway, that's.
So that's that.
Well, I think we should. Do you want to move on, or do you want to say more
Yeah,
about?
let's carry on with
Yeah,
Laws of Judgment.
yeah. Laws of Judgment. So the time of judgment, for people not familiar, we did an episode of that at the end of the World of Darkness, before they brought it back. Vampire, werewolf, and mage got their own end of the world book, and then they had time of judgment for all the other games besides Wraith. Laws of Judgment is the LARP version, except for it has all the games, including Wraith and Mage, and it has all of them have their own chapter. And then was this a rewritten or copy paste from?
This was copy paste. Well, no,
Yeah.
I take that back. It was, I think, copy pasted, and then some of the sections are rearranged, like the
Hmm.
storytelling section is bumped up closer to the start, and that some of the phrasing is like tightened or padded. So I assume there was just an editing
Yeah,
pass.
it says things like in the core book. It would say Shining Host, right, or see
Yeah.
Shining Host Player's Guide. There was little sidebars like they added Augmen rules for.
Yes. Or the transformation as it is in this scenario.
Yeah,
Which I guess because we've talked about before how in The Shining Host, dreaming games are really not a thing. And so I was like, oh yeah, they wouldn't have had really augment rules. But then in that one scenario, you're bringing that to Earth. It's like you need to talk about how do you game that. And another one of the sidebars is like, advice to the storyteller about using weird art to decorate the space and make it feel more dreaming-y. It's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So that was cool. Another thing that came up on page 151, they have the distinction between the different types of winter and spring. So there's long winter is a dark and terrible time when the Fae will largely vanish and glamour will be all but extinguished. A new spring will eventually follow. Versus endless winter, a world where the Fae die out, glamour fades away, and the dreaming is cut off forever. The mortal world endures in a diminished form. And Fimble winter, the ultimate destruction of both the dreaming and the autumn world, snuffing out all life and glamour forever. Also used to refer to the world of the Fomorians or other dark beings rise to claim it as their own. So I like
Mm-hmm.
that because it almost makes me think that there's like denominations of the Fae with different eschatology about what winter is, and they use different terminology for it. I like that as an in-setting thing.
Yeah.
Similarly, they have mortal spring versus Fae spring versus universal spring. It's like who's going to come out the other side into the new spring that follows. So it's like, which church are you part of, Kithane? Anyway. So yeah, otherwise though, it's you could just read the Time of Judgment chapter and it's the same thing. There's like
Yeah. A through line of all three of these books so far is they're porting to LARP, maybe like what was in tabletop, maybe like adjusting the mechanics a bit because it had to be. It's not the same mechanics, but
yeah,
other than that, it's like the same.
words
Like,
in many
yeah,
cases.
yeah, and but it's also not useful. Like the Time of Judgment doesn't actually really tell me much about how to do a story, like handle this in a LARP context. Like
Yeah.
especially something where it's like not just like 5 or 10 players. Like how do you do this kind of? How do you make it not all just all the players are just constantly asking the few storytellers you have to play NPCs because it's just them interacting with NPCs. Like that doesn't.
Yeah. And like on the one hand, I wouldn't want the Laws of Judgment book to start like introducing a whole bunch of new stuff because it's like this is the end, this is
Mhm.
the wrap up book. But on the other hand, I really like, even I say this even as someone who hasn't done a Changeling LARP, when the text goes into things like those details about physically setting up the scene or
Mhm.
mechanically paying attention to things like, I think we saw this in Shining Host, the area of effect of cantrips, like, within 10 paces or
Oh yeah,
time.
oh yeah. The Shining Host has so much of this. Like
Yeah,
it tells you how to run a Changeling LARP, not just
right.
work Changeling to LARP rules.
And all of that brings to life more for me LARP as a different medium, which I think is
Hmm.
where it thrives. I don't need it to go quite as far as like, in the revised era when you had like every discipline power in every vampire book was like, here's the write up, here's the much longer Mind's Eye Theater write up, or like the
Yeah,
character sheets being double sided. That strikes me as trying too hard to get player bases to cross over. I just want the LARP books to sell themselves as LARP books more, and I
yeah,
suspect you could draw a line between the Mind's Eye Theater authors who cared about that and the ones who didn't.
yeah. And I could say there's a pattern. Like originally, mechanically, it was actually even more different. Like if you look at Mind's Eye
Mhm.
Theater over time, it becomes more and more tabletop like in some ways mechanically. And that's why you have like 4 health levels in the Shining Host, but in Laws of the Night revised, the Vampire one for the revised era, it's 7 health levels. Like that's one example. And then it sort of when we got into the BNS stuff, it's like it went in a whole other direction. It's like let's
Mm.
make the setting different. I'm like, but that's not. Why would I want to?
Well, yeah, the retconning. I mean,
I want to be like I'm into Changeling, and I can play a tabletop or play around a tabletop, and I can play around the LARP. And what you have to do to play it is different, but I still want it to be the same world.
mhm.
Just like if they made a Changeling, the Dreaming TV series, or you had the novels that came out, you don't want those to be like, this is just fairy stories in a different setting. What are you doing? This is a different, you want it to still feel like the same world, right?
Yeah.
So,
I have a commentary about that aspect actually as we move into talking about the other two pieces that we have for
hmm,
discussion. So,
yep.
in addition to these books for Mind's Eye Theater, there was a brief lived, I guess for 2 years, quarterly magazine or whatever called the Mind's Eye Theater Journal, 8 issues total. And each one had like a hodgepodge of articles and fiction and new mechanics and whatever, some of which for Changeling eventually found their way into the Shining Host Player's Guide. But there are
Hmm.
two bits which we have not hitherto talked about. the first of which is a story in the 4th issue of the magazine called Mr. Frost. And this is apparently Pete Woodworth's first piece of fiction in the game line. I mean, certainly there were bits here and there, but as a proper, like, standalone story. Briefly, we have a slew of curiosity shop owner who's helping a motley of 5 childlings. They disturbed a Tremere.
It took me a while to figure out it was a slua, Mr. Frost. It eventually says it, but I'm like,
Yeah.
Is this a new kid?
It's like hidden somewhere in the beginning, yeah.
Yeah.
But so these childlings disturbed a Tremere ritual in the so-called haunted house at the edge of town, so now they're afraid for their lives, the vampires are threatening them, whatever. So Mr. Frost the Slua asks them to bring items to trade, which he then distributes to various contacts around town, including possibly a Malkavian elder. Not really sure what that was.
Yeah, I was thinking Nosferatu, but I'm not sure.
I got the feeling it was Malkavian, just from the...
Okay.
But then he engineers this plan where he essentially blackmails the local prince into kicking out the Tremere by taping the kids telling their story for a local news show, and then simultaneously working Fae connections to slate the house for renovation.
It's like if the Weekly World News was also
right.
a local news show run by a puka. But yeah.
Which, I want to follow that storyline. That sounds brilliant. So, and it works. The plan works.
Yeah.
So the Slua Grump saves the day for these precocious but ultimately foolhardy children. And what could be more changeling than that?
And I think very unseelie Slua Grump, the way that was presented.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I read this thinking, is this more Mind's Eye Theater than tabletop in the way that it presents changeling? Like, that was the question. And on the surface, I would say no, because we see fiction like this regularly in the tabletop game. But then, looking at it more carefully, I think it does resemble more of what I envision a LARP scene to be. Because you have mostly people talking in mostly mundane spaces, making bargains and trading objects that could easily be game props. So.
Yeah. I'd say structurally it's almost LARP. Like, you would typically have most of these scenes be in different places, like in a freehold or something, or like more people around. It's got a lot of one or a handful of people going somewhere else and then talking to one or a handful of people in very distinct locations. So that's not very LARP. Yeah. But other than that, like, talking, doing favors and trading other things to get people to use their specific types of influence to affect things, that's very LARP.
And there's no visible magic. There's no big combats. There's no chimera or journeys into the dreaming or anything like that.
Yeah, I would say, like, this is the if you want to talk about like core activities. I don't know what the core activity of a tabletop game is, but this type of thing is more like bread and butter in that way. Maybe or compared to like D&D combat. Like this type of thing is what combat is in D&D for a LARP.
Yeah, and I know you can do like the big political drama scenes and duels and whatnot in LARP too, but this kind of tale makes me think that maybe it does a better job of modeling the sort of like mundane side of changeling life.
Yeah. LARP sessions, you can have lots of things happen, but the bulk of what they happen in the bulk of sessions are lots of people having small conversations with each other, with other, maybe people are sneaking around listening or something. Like, it's like, oh, we'll have a ball, or at a, like the local count is having a ball, or satyr running a freehold here is having a party, or 2 characters are getting married, so it's now like a wedding thing.
Hooray.
Or like, it's all that kind of thing, or like some of it's nobility, some of it's commoner focused, whatever. But it's like, I mean, Book of Days would be, actually, if you look at any of these celebrations, anything in there that would be incredibly handy as a LARP book, even though you didn't write it as one, because it's got a whole bunch of things that you can use in Changeling. Like, this is a reason for changelings to get together. Therefore, you have a game session. But when they get together, you're not just pretending to dance or something. You're like having conversations in the background all the time, and some of them are politicking and some of them are just chatting or whatever, but that's like what you're doing for the bulk of your role playing, is you're just talking to other characters.
And I love that. So
yeah. And it's also like one of those things, like, this could happen, like, if this was structured a little bit differently so they were all sort of in the same space, the storyteller might have been like, okay, I'm going to introduce the plot of these Tremere terrorizing these childlings. And then the next the storyteller hears about it is when Mr. Frost goes to the Malkavian. Because everything else was between player characters, and maybe no storyteller even saw any of these other stuff happen. So, I miss running LARPs.
I can tell.
But it's fun. It's like, you have no idea what's happening. That seems bad, but...
Well, maybe this is the year.
Yeah, maybe.
So then lastly, another Pete Woodworth piece. There's an article in the final issue, issue 8, called How Does It Feel?, which provides some thoughts on
Hmm.
the experience, or is it the qualia? Is that the philosophical term?
I think so.
So of being supernatural, basically, across all lines. The phenomenology of being supernatural.
Yeah, there we go.
I just going to read out these bullet points at the start. So he describes the basic rules for playing a supernatural creature as, first, repeat after me, my character is not just a human with neat superpowers. Second, supernatural powers are not accidental, and characters can't simply learn them from thin air. Even fey magic still operates according to rules, however bizarre or arcane those rules might be. Most powers take some concentration or ritual, many require the expenditure of vital energies. Most importantly, all powers require some time to practice and master, even those that a character acquires instinctively. We'll skip the third one because it's about vampires and wraiths, but then the fourth one, if your character is a shapeshifter or a fairy, she was never human to begin with. She looked like one for a while, and she might think like one still, but like it or not, she was born of a different species. She cannot escape what she truly is forever. Which I think are like good things to remember at the table as well as in a LARP.
Hmm. Oh yeah, this whole thing I think works just as is
Yeah.
also just as useful for tabletop.
I mean, it ties into what we've talked about before about sensory based narration and trying to like really get at that experience, but also bleed, not non-bleed. Is there a term for being in the part of the character headspace where you're actively separating it from your own experience? Like,
Well, there's like a director stance and
can we call it clot or clotting?
yeah. Well, I mean, there's terms for it. I know there's terms for it from like indie
Stanching,
tabletop stuff. Like there's stances and like actor stance versus director stance versus anyway.
a
But
tourniquet. I'm just going to go with the blood theme and,
mhm.
Anyway, so the specific things for changeling, I think, are these short enough that I can read these out too, and then we can just
Yep.
briefly talk about each? All right, so there's 5. First is encountering something banal. Even from a distance, truly banal things seem to be surrounded by a reverse heat haze, where instead of being all wavy and squiggly, things seem flat, colors are nondescript, and outlines are painfully clear. None of it has any mystery or charm. As one gets closer, the mouth goes dry, the stomach bubbles with low-level nausea, and a dull headache sets in behind the eyes, making concentration hard and forcing the Fae to struggle for any graceful movements or clever words. Those who actually manage a creative act feel absurd and self-conscious, as if being watched by a bored and disapproving audience. So that bit at the end, I think, is a really good note. Because I imagine
Mhm.
most players play those kinds of encounters as like, haha, screw you, banality. I got one over on you. And like, maybe they should have.
Yep.
So then Spending Glamour, this one is in character by Lady Casey, satyr photographer, who says, imagine how it thrills the heart to make a wish and see it come true. Glamour is a wild, radiant burst of energy coursing through mind and body. Sometimes even the best of us start to wonder if we can control what we've called up just because it's always so powerful. Even once the glamour is spent, it fades into pleasant exhaustion, a sense of beauty wrested from nothing. Putting the final stroke on a painting, jotting down the last few notes to a song, finding the perfect closing for a story, and relaxing after a wonderful lovemaking session are the only things that approach the sublime experience of glamour's passing. So,
Mhm.
it's fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I like these in general. Like I like its existence. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if I 100% agree with every single word, but
It is in character, so.
yeah.
And the fact that spending is in quotes and the header spending glamour is telling, like,
Yeah.
I guess it makes me think it's not that when you're spending glamour, it's gone forever. It's just out of
No.
your hands. That's
Yeah,
kind
it
of the
goes into
feel.
you and then it leaves out of you.
Yeah. So then for gaining glamour, like the blood vintages of the Canaanites, glamour's feel largely depends on how a changeling gains it. Some Fae gather the dark essence found in frights, chills, and nightmares, and they come to crave the icy burn of such twisted glamour as it suffuses their frames. At once forbidding and as enticing as a dead lover's whisper, it flows over their flesh in chill night breezes. Other Fae drink deep of the heady, intoxicating passion to be found in physical ecstasy, musical abandon, or other headlong flights of glamour. They savor the surging tingle of primal joy and happiness that accompanies it. Glamour from children's art is often sticky and sweet, like summer candy, while the works of older artists make up in subtlety and nuance what they often lack in immediate energy and vibrancy. Mortal creativity is a boundless rainbow of sensation, and no fairy ever experiences quite the same sensation twice. When rewarding glamour, storytellers should take care to remember where it's coming from and describe it accordingly, even if only briefly. Players will think a lot more about spending the dreams of a good friend or an innocent class of amateur poets than they will if they're simply told, you gain 3 glamour traits. So here you have it, glamour resonance.
Yep. Although I like it because it's also there's no need to make it mechanical, but it just
Actually, something that occurred to me reading this, we had a discussion on Mage the Podcast Discord a couple days ago about ludonarrative dissonance, which is a term that just has great feel in the
I
mouth.
keep picturing that that guy from what wasn't that one of the characters from Labyrinth?
Oh, Ludo, yeah. Yeah. Smell bad.
Yeah, so he's got narrative dissonance. Got it.
So the thing with that is it almost makes me think about musing and ravaging thresholds as being a problem because we have all these examples here. And I mean, changeling text
Hmm.
regularly has like these very extensive descriptions of all the different flavors of glamour and all the different ways you can get it. And I'm thinking like, well, okay, if my changeling's threshold is destroy hope or whatever, very few of those will apply.
But isn't the threshold just you get -1 difficulty at doing it? Like you can still do all the things, the
Yeah,
ways.
but it makes it sound like I don't think there's enough structure around that idea in the way the
Yeah,
game is presented. That's my
yeah.
point.
At the very least, I think we need more thresholds. And I
Yeah,
don't mean like the stuff in the D20 player's guide, but just more examples. And if they threw this sensory stuff for all of them, it's like here's the ways
yeah.
of gaining glamour through epiphany, like through musing. Here's the way of gaining glamour through ravaging. But like you go through what it would feel like all the different ways. That would be good.
See the upcoming Book of Grimaire for the C30 project.
Hmm.
Shameless plug. So then for Bedlam, we have another in character by John Doe. You besmocked fascists are all deluding yourselves. The colors I see are brighter. The sounds I hear are sweeter. The Chimera aren't afraid of me anymore. They gather around, even here. Sure, there's some pretty strange stuff out there around the edges, but I don't care. This is the world we wanted. We finally won. The autumn will never come now. It's not even cold in here, surrounded by steel and the Dauntain. You fools. I may be a prisoner, but you've all failed. You're too late. I guess so. I mean,
Yeah, that one felt weird for Bedlam for me. That
it just felt like a flat take, on what it would be like. I mean, that doesn't really tell me anything about the experience of it.
hmm and it should be more scary than that. I think, at
Hmm.
least sometimes.
Last but not least, losing yourself to banality. Describing this sensation is tricky because the Fae won't remember sliding to banality. That's kind of the point, actually. For those who have a little more time to witness their own decline, though, the ride is no less horrifying. First, the colors of the chimerical world start looking bleached, the sounds come across flat, the once charming scents become tired and musty. Like a receiver picking up two stations at once, the mortal world begins to overlap the chimerical more and more often. The overlap can be from merely flickering seconds to several minutes at a time, which can have predictably disastrous consequences in moments of stress or drama. Worst of all, the character starts forgetting the details of his very life as banality climbs higher. Chimeras seem frightening and strange. Putting names to faces becomes a real chore, even with close friends and oathmates. Reminiscing on times past, be they good or ill, is an exercise in tearful frustration. Finally, the changeling can't remember who she is, what her place is in this strange world, or why she's seeing the things she is, and she simply drops out of the chimerical world. Her banal mind chooses to ignore what she is no longer capable of understanding.
Yeah, this one was disturbing for me because I've been having trouble sleeping for the past few weeks, and
Yeah.
that first paragraph is just applying to me in general.
Oh no. Well, yeah, I mean, or anyone with like real memory issues, like this is a little
Yeah,
bit triggering, maybe.
yeah.
But also, it's
It,
helpful. I mean,
mhm.
players often forget that it's a regular feature of Fey life.
It feels also it both works, but also feels like almost not banal to me. Like it feels like a different problem, but it also makes sense that it would be that way. So I don't know how to.
Yeah. And this is also related to when we've talked before about, part of the reason Fae hang out with other Fae is that it helps them remember. It's like the
Hmm.
two steps down on the mist
Yeah,
chart or whatever it is.
yeah. Well,
So,
or the detailed rules we had in
yeah.
Lost of the Hunt on that, but which I think maybe might be worth grabbing for your changeling game, or at least looking at.
But I like that this puts those emotive words to the experience and
Yep.
describes it as being frustrating or horrifying or,
Hmm.
you know, what those words signify. That to me is easier than figuring out like how to make this an obstacle in game. Rather than work around the dots of banality or the temporary banality that a character has, describing it in those terms just like as part of your general narration,
Yep.
I don't know. I think that's probably the best strategy.
Yeah.
Certainly it's better than not considering it at all, which is what a lot of people do.
And this also fits with like the fact that this is from the LARP journal.
Yeah.
This definitely doesn't have to be true about LARP, but I found in general when I was LARPing, like Changeling LARP versus Changeling Tabletop, interacting with people who do both, is the LARP end is less focused on solving problems and obstacles and challenges that your character faces,
Mm-hmm.
and more in trying to experience what it's like to be your character and like having interesting interactions and stuff like that. Like it, I mean, you can definitely still do that in tabletop, and it does happen. And it's not only that in LARP, but
Yeah. And it's important because a healthy proportion of people, I think, approach Changeling as playing D&D in the real world. And that
yeah,
is not what it is at all. And this is the kind of thing that underscores that difference.
yeah. Now, if
So,
you want to do that with D&D too, sure.
yeah, you
Yeah,
can, but
but it's not the focus. Yeah.
yeah. And when people enter Changeling with the sense that it's not the focus, it's like, well, read this.
See, Puka, this part was all talking about how to have more bleed, by the way.
Yay! So, pick at that scab and
Yeah.
undo the clot and let the bleed through. Anyway, Mind's Eye Theater.
Yep. I think that's all of it. If there's another World of Darkness published book that has changeling content of significant size that we missed, let us know. But I think we might have got it all finally.
I'm going to make a request, actually, in that regard.
Yep.
So, if any listener is in a Spanish-speaking country and has purchased or accessed or whatever the Spanish version of the C20 material, there's a Spanish-only PDF, Sueños en Guerra. I cannot locate it anywhere. It's not like available for sale or anything. If you would be willing to share it with us, that would be fantastic. I am going to write to the publisher in the meantime and see if we can get a copy.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, after that, I've got nothing.
Yep.
Unless the French one just came out too, and I don't know if they had a special PDF.
But maybe there's some other weird book, like I can't even think what book it would be. Second edition Mage had like a section. I think we would have heard about it, but if it exists, let us know. If there's some
And we
other,
do have a few slated for this season. We do have
yeah.
a couple books where there is Fey content that we're going to consider. So for now, I think it's kind of turned into a maxi minisode.
Mm-hmm. But if you want to tell us about these things, you could send us an email, podcast@changingthepodcast.com. You can join our Discord, discord.me/CTP. You could leave a comment on our website for changelingthepodcast.com. We're still currently on Facebook, although we'll see how that goes soon, for Changeling the Podcast. We're on Mastodon for changelingpod@dice.camp, so you can send us a toot there.
And what the hell, by the time this goes out, there will probably be a Blue Sky. So
something. Yeah. We can look at that. There's a way we could like have changelingthepodcast.com be part of the Blue Sky to verify it, but we'll talk about that. But whatever exists will be links in the show notes.
Huzzah.
Wait, no, that's your job.
Yes.
And I'm Josh.
I remain Booga.
I think the glamour I got from this episode's got a bit of a chocolate note.
Dark or milk?
Maybe like is there something in between? Semi-sweet? I don't know.
I'll accept this. The metaphor of bleed in LARP lends itself to all manner of subsidiary metaphorical terms for other processes that may take place in relation to the character/player interface. If you say or do something to help stop another player from applying their out-of-game knowledge in a scene, or to keep them from being too emotionally impacted by something happening to their character, that's gauze. To do the opposite and facilitate someone else's bleed with your own is to give them a transfusion. And if once you start blurring that line you just can't stop, you might be a hemophiliac. Vampire LARPs probably get more out of this than Changeling ones, but no doubt there's a redcap player or two who will just eat this kind of thing up, whether figuratively or otherwise. Meanwhile, this outro is itself a form of bleed, obscuring the line between formal recording and associated community involvement time, emphasized by the recitation of our patrons, who include Derek, Dorcadus, Ellerus, Eobol, Jason Vines, Oreo, Razgaboos, Sandjigger, Sija, Simon Strand, Terry Robinson, and Victor Torrey. If you'd like to become a patron to support our show and get a sweet shout-out at the end of each episode, visit www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. We also welcome reviews on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience, and we hope you'll tell your friends and enablers about our show as well. LARP strong, pick the crust away from your mind's eye, and until next time, keep on dreaming.